Last, Leonard Doyle, the Director of Communications, a communications specialist for the International Organization for Migration, and as Carol said, in Haiti, and as Carol said earlier, the former foreign editor of The Independent of England and longtime foreign correspondent. Leonard has been an invaluable help to the Pulitzer Center journalists all this past year in Haiti, and I'm sure to many other journalists working there as well. He's also spearheaded an innovative outreach, community engagement, communication strategy that's been featured on the front page of the New York Times and beyond, and he's going to sort of talk us through a bit of that today with the approach that IOM is taking. Leonard.
Let's get this up and going. Full screen?
Down, yeah, full screen. Great. So, hello to everybody. I've a confession to make at the beginning because they've all outed me, which is that I'm a recovering journalist. So, with that in mind, I'll kind of infect my my talk with a little bit of that as well. One thing important about Haiti, important to remember, is that you're talking about a dysfunctional society which has had, decades of poor governance, of what one well-known writer on Haiti calls a predatory elite. And I would suggest that that hasn't changed. So we can talk about planning, and we can talk about aid, and we can talk about the rest of it. But until we kind of talk about the internal workings of Haiti, we won't really understand why it has failed and why it is failing now. I'll show you quickly why it's failing, because we had 1.5 million people thrown out of their homes, the survivors of the earthquake, who were living in tent cities which were managed by organizations like the one I work with, International Organization for Migration, which works in Ivory Coast, Libya, what have you, trying to give people shelter in conditions like this. In the last year, about half of those people have moved on. So there's room for celebration, but not really, because many of them have moved on at the point of a stick. In other words, they've been evicted. They've been evicted because there's no solutions. There's no planning. There's no access to land. They're being evicted right now at a rate 1 in 4 of the 680,000 people still living in camps are under threat of eviction. So where do they go? Well, they go back to the ravines that they were rescued from this time last year, when the American military came in and said, you're going to die if you stay there, you're going to die in the rainy season. Are they going back to what they call red houses, that is to say houses with big cracks up the wall, and they're going to have their children living in these houses waiting for the hurricanes and the rainy season to come? And they're moving back out of camps which, odious as they are relatively safe because they've got chlorinated water and they've got some prospect of healthcare. So they're moving back into basically a Hobbesian environment where cholera is already spiking and we haven't even reached the rainy season. So the humanitarian crisis is far from over. And this is happening at a time when humanitarian organizations are pulling out. Because, as one of the speakers a few minutes ago talked about, the fundraising imperative of humanitarian organizations, well, they've run out of money now. They spent it all. They spent all the taxpayers' dollars and their own, and there will be no more camp management, as it's called, by the middle of this summer. So we're looking at a kind of series of events which are coming our way, which are not going to be very pretty and not very nice for the Haitians in particular. So what I really want to talk about today is why is this the case? Why has Haiti not got its act together in any meaningful way? And why are we still why are we in a worse position today than we were last year and less media attention? And one of the reasons is lack of access to land. There is plenty of land. If you fly into Port-au-Prince, you'll see green acres all over the place. But there is a society which is cleaved between the haves and the have-nots in a way which you couldn't even imagine. And there is the degree of solidarity between those who have assets and those who don't is striking. One thing which I will say about the US, which I've been an interested commentator on all my career, is that in the heart of the media here you have something which I would call respect. So even if you have think you have a very partisan media with the Fox News on one side and NPR on the other, in fact when reporters go out on stories, I'm sure Donna will agree on this, they go and they look for the best and the heroic and the interesting, and they want to bring it to as broad a population as possible. Well, you don't get that in the media in many developing countries. They're just not interested in the people. I've been with people in Pétionville, in Port-au-Prince, and they asked me, why do we even give the vote to those people? They're just going to give us the wrong president. And that is a mindset which we are in some ways trying to combat. And I think this issue of respect comes to the heart of it, because if you don't have respect for your population, then you're not going to give your population a say. They're not going to be involved in what's going on. If you don't have the mother, whom we talked about earlier, involved in policing the aid, then when that aid gets diverted, who's going to talk about it? Usually the NGO won't talk about it because it's too embarrassed to. And the person who's diverting the aid certainly isn't going to talk about it. So what we've been doing is just, I'll revert to that slide. That slide showed somebody looking at a letterbox in Haiti. So we've put letterboxes in the camps, and we found that there's been an extraordinary response from people, ordinary people who were told were illiterate. In one camp we got 900 letters in 3 days. And these we've turned into a rather elegant book, some of them anyway, which I'll show you here, called The Voice of the Voiceless, or somebody said The Voice of the Inaudible. And we're trying to create what you might want to call a feedback loop for Haitians, because one thing that doesn't happen is humanitarian organizations tend not to listen. The Haitian media certainly doesn't listen. So we're trying to see if we can find a mechanism to listen to ordinary Haitians. And one way we've found, which I think is going to work now, is to link that into the aid that's going into the country. So we're very concerned about aid in Haiti because it has the worst perceptions of corruption in any country in the world. So people don't want to give money to somebody who's got a bad record for nicking it. So the idea being, going back to the mother, how can we put the mother in charge of the decision? The one person probably in any developing country who has an interest in that aid going to the right place is the mother. The mother with 5 kids wants there to be a school donated by the Canadian government or whoever. They want there to be 10 teachers as promised. But as we know, as happens everywhere in the developing world, the 5 teachers becomes no teachers, or becomes 5 teachers on no salaries. The 100 nurses becomes 100 nurses with no salaries, month after month after month, because somebody up the food chain decides to take the money. And I'll show you one of those people in a minute. This is Shakun, a woman who was raped shortly after the earthquake. She wrote some interesting letters to her, and she's now working with us as a citizen journalist. So anybody can be a journalist, as long as they're a communicator. I'd put the emphasis on communication. So the letters we receive, and we read them, and we put them into a database. And right down the middle here, you see summaries of the letters. And these letters are now going to be available to any media outlet anywhere, especially in Haiti, but especially in the regions. And as we put these letterboxes in front of projects and people complain, they will be fed through this. And even if the people implementing the projects don't like it, it's just too bad. We're going to give some visibility to and allow the population, led by our journalist here on the left, Sandra, to tell us what's going on. We're calling it the tambour loop after the drum, the Haitian drum. So the letters come in, they're fed around, and eventually we try and find some solutions. On the left you see 500 projects by the World Bank. On the right you see 500 projects by Interaction, a great big consortium of NGOs. There's another 500 of the UN. We want all of these projects to be scrutinized by the mother that we talked about a little while ago. This guy here is quite interesting. The organization I work for had a guy murdered in September. It was on a Friday night. On Saturday we brought his family, traumatized, to the morgue to have an autopsy on his body so that they could release the body. This guy, the coroner of Port-au-Prince, demanded $1,000. And here he is counting it out, unashamed that he's being photographed. Now this is a problem in a society where you don't have feedback loops. You don't have what you have in this country. For all that you may criticize the media here, you have feedback loops. You have people talking to each other. Issues come up and they are resolved through the media, whether it's Fox News or the other side. In a society like Haiti, you don't have that, and we're trying to see if we can engineer that a little bit. How are we doing it? Well, here's one of the brochures we just prepared. The woman on the left, this is Sandra again, blowing what they call the lambi, or the horn that used to alert Haitian slaves when the slaveholders were coming or when the French were on their way. So she's the kind of person who's blowing the news. The story, this is a sort of flyer that will be handed out, and it teaches people that just by making a call or writing a letter, you'll get your info will get churned into the UN machine, and there'll be a meeting. And finally, you'll hopefully get yourself a hurricane-proof school rather than one that falls down because it's not built to the proper codes. We also have this comic strip which we produce. This one is just hot off the presses, and it deals with issues like stigmatization, because the education level is so low that people actually get chopped up because their neighbor accuses them of throwing something called cholera powder on them. you're dealing with a very low base, and it's not changing. There are extremely wealthy people in Haiti. It's an extractive industry of a country in many ways, and the money is certainly not going back into educating the population. Here we have some mappers that we're working with who are doing community mapping. Rob talked a little bit about that earlier. And here we have solutions. So the New York Times was very helpful in the coverage it gave us, and it does lead to pressure. Media leads to pressure. It's the squeaky wheel that gets the oil. And enough media pressure on the point of a problem does actually lead to solutions. It embarrasses, and it pushes, and it pokes, and it causes things to happen. Finally, the basic message is that the more voices you have out there, rather than the fewer, the more balance you get, and the more signal you get, and the less noise you get. So finally, we have a little social media platform. It's our baby Huffington Post. It's called Citizen Haiti. I'll make a shameless ad for it now. It's called citizenhaiti.org. And it's an opportunity for ordinary Haitians and the diaspora to work together through this feedback loop, which I mentioned, so that we can get the people who are excluded from the information loop back in on the game, and hopefully have the Haitians rebuild their society rather than the likes of us. Okay.